raised a Series A fund of about $14 million.
How was your experience working with, so much experienced founders at FrontRow?
A lot of times investors put pressure about improving design. I think one of the biggest things that you realize is a lack of structure.
Hello, welcome to the Founding Designer series. In this episode, we sit with Aditya Das, an engineer turned designer who joined as a founding designer at FrontRow. FrontRow was an edtech platform that built courses for skills like music, comedy, singing, and more, and collaborated with celebrity guests to teach these skills. In this episode, we will go in depth about how is it like to work as a founding designer at an early stage company. What are the expectations and challenges from a founding designer? How do you negotiate compensation? How do you evaluate a startup company and its founder before joining? So let's start. Hey Aditya, hi. So I want to start this conversation with a three-part question. Let's start with how did you get to know about FrontRow? How did you apply? What was your interview process like? And how was your first month at FrontRow? It's like a complex question, but let's start with this.
So how I got to know about FrontRow was through a friend of mine. He was a college classmate and he had joined FrontRow as a founding engineer. He was working with FrontRow for a few months because FrontRow had just raised funding, and on the design aspect of things, they were pretty much relying on certain studios or freelance agencies. So when they started to decided that we want to hire a full-time designer, my friend did tell me that, hey, I know that you were looking out, why don't you interview? So I did do the interviews. It went pretty well. I got selected there. And we were a team of 2 people initially, and then we grew it to a team of 5 people. We raised a Series A fund of about $14 million. And I started leading the team pretty much a year into my role. And it was also a very interesting experience to lead such a team at very early stage, which I was in my career at that time. FrontRow shut down operations sometime last year, post which I've mostly been working independently with a bunch of companies. I've been consulting with a few. My interview process was fairly simple. I had one round of discussions with the founder. So when I joined the company, it was fairly early stage. Like there were, I believe, a total of 10 to 12 employees. And when I joined, I interviewed with the founder. So one round of discussion was to explain about what FrontRow does, to understand about my background, what I've been doing. Post which I was given an assignment, which I finished. It was not a very big assignment. It was redesigning a few screens from certain app. So post that, we again had a round of discussion with the founders about why I took the design decisions which I took. I think in a week they rolled out the offer. We had a negotiation round on phone itself, and then I joined them. Right, like that whole process took around not a couple of weeks. I think close to about 3 weeks, including everything, 3 to 4 weeks, I would say. And my first month was very interesting because mostly my experience before this was to work with freelance clients. And while I was exposed to how work would happen in freelance, this was the first time I was working on something which was already out in prod, right? We already had something. So my work would go into a product which was already live. That was the first time for me in that regard, right?
Aditya joined FrontRow, right? He's the only designer, right? You got your first project. You're still new to the journey. What are some of the challenges that you faced yourself where you felt like, oh my God, this is like kind of a big thing for me?
I think one of the biggest thing that you realize is a lack of structure. At least I did not go to any design schools as such, but I was quite aware to see like how people used to approach typically design problems, right? You'd find a lot of case studies where people are doing research, they are doing empathy maps, they are doing persona mapping, a lot of these processes. But what you would actually realize if you join an early stage company is that there's none of these processes. You just get a problem statement and you have to arrive at the solution as quickly as you can. And then you have to just ensure that it works, right? Like you can test it out, you can iterate upon it, but you have to just ensure that it works. So a lot of my friends who joined FrontRow, they joined in a stage where they would get a feature request from the CTO that today we need to make a feed. And by tomorrow morning, they would just make a feed. And now the app had a feed where you could talk to other learners. So from there on, it eventually grows on where you have a proper 2 week sprint that we would run. We would spec out the requirement clearly. We would set up what kind of North Star are we chasing? What's our success metric for this feature? We would do proper retrospective after the feature goes live. But yeah, at the stage where I joined, I would say we were at like 20% there. We would have certain PRDs that PMs would write, but we would not have a lot of attention to data. We would not pay a lot of attention to designing more thoughtfully. It would be very quick. You have to really come at the solution really quickly, and it should scale. It should work at scale. That was the first one, right? The second one also is that because it's an early stage company and there's no established design team, a lot of the feedback that you'd receive are not design structured design feedbacks. Like nobody would probably come and tell you, okay, the typography here needs to improve. Maybe somebody might say that, okay, it's not readable. The font size is too small. We need to increase this. But if you were to join a typical team which has a good design leadership, who have experienced people, they can give you a lot more specific feedback to your designing.
If you can pick out any one feature that you built, if you could just very specifically tell what was the problem statement, right? And the people involved, and in how much time did you create a solution and then improve it?
So I think from the early stage, I think because you're talking about that, one of the examples I could give you is this idea of community, right? Like for us, we wanted to build it in a very community-like fashion, that all the learners who are interested in writing a joke or learning how to sing, they should have a community where they would want to participate, and they can exchange ideas. And that was the hypothesis we were trying to validate. But we very soon realized that that had some major problems. Number one, that whenever you make a community, it requires heavy moderation, because a lot of a crowd would come from tier 2 cities, tier 3 cities at certain times, and we didn't want any people to spoil the experience for others. So there were a lot of bad actors that you need to take care of. That's one part of it. The second part of it also is that you cannot monetize community very easily unless there's something very, very good value that you could offer people. But we realized eventually, like in a span of couple of months or so, that although we put a lot of effort into it, it wasn't going to give us monetary benefits, tangible benefits as such. So I think the total design process was fairly quick. It took us around a couple of weeks to design all the other aspects of community. Like we also sort of shipped it in a couple of weeks more, so around 1 month for the whole development process. And then, as I said, it required a lot of moderation. So there was a lot of people who were in the ops team moderating these communities, right? And then post those 2 months or around 3 more months, that is when we realized that it's kind of difficult to scale. It makes an interesting pitch, but it becomes quite difficult to scale a community like that. So yeah, total timeline then becomes around 4 months since the beginning to the sunset of the feature.
Whenever you work at a big company, right, or you have a background of working at a big company, jahan pe there is a process, things are slow, there is some level of bureaucracy also there, right? You join an early stage company, which is like a train. You're building while it's going on. Adapting to the speed becomes a challenge. How did you adapt working with the speed at which everyone around you is working?
In my case specifically, I think the adoption part was fairly easy because, as I was saying earlier, the two things that I used to do before I joined was number one, work with freelance clients, and number two, go to a bunch of hackathons. Now, the concept of hackathon in itself is a very time constrained process, right? You have to build a whole product almost like in the span of 36 hours, 72 hours sometimes. So one of the strengths that I used to consider for myself, and I still do, is my speed while designing. Now, of course, when you design something with speed, there's obvious trade-offs that you could clearly see. Like when you're coming to work at an early stage company, a lot of the times people don't expect super polished designs. They actually expect something which would work quickly, scale quickly, and if at all it doesn't work, they'd be happy to like chuck it out and work on something else. So they don't have to carry that sort of dead weight with them, that, oh, we built this feature, although it's great, but it took us 4 weeks. But now we could clearly see it didn't work for just 2 years. I mean, just 2 months. That is one part. And that is mainly what helped me sort of adopt, because I was used to designing stuff very quickly. But yeah, eventually, as I said, as I was speaking about it earlier, it has a few set of downsides where eventually you need to also unlearn how to just do things quickly and also learn how to do things well. So I think that is sort of an interesting balance which you need to learn to do, because the company, as it grows, it will never tell you that, hey, while you were working great, now we want to increase increase the bar of our quality. So why don't you like completely change your mental model, and from tomorrow onwards make great designs instead of quick designs, right?
When you raise funds, when you have some investor also give you pressure that, you need to improve your design a little bit, right? So सबको आदत हो चुकी होती है कि Aditya will ship any design in, let's say, of this complexity, let's say in day or 2 day, right? And that's the expectation that has been set, right? No one will come and tell you, hey, you have 3 days to solve the problem that you used to complete in 2 hours, right? They'll still expect you to do in 2 hours, but you have to improve the design. Eventually, there might be some focus on design. How did you incorporated a process or, tactics wherein you would slowly and gradually improve the quality of your designs as well?
Right.
Right.
I think that's a very interesting question, specifically because, as you said, right, a lot of times investors put pressure about improving design. Interestingly enough, that was exactly what had happened when we actually raised our Series A round. So before you raise a, there's a lot of auditing work that happens for the company, right? They want to see all the numbers that you're actually showing, are they true? Actual user groups are selected to use your product and give feedback on it, not just from this country, from around the world. And one of the things that we got pretty good set of feedback upon was the design. And there was now an expectation to ship not just things that work, but they also look good, they feel good, and how that happened is also interesting. So I mean, expectation is very easy to create for anybody, right? Like as soon as an investor would say something like that, the founder would immediately expect, okay, I will just go and tell my designer to do stuff better, and that should solve this problem. I think one way that worked fairly well for me was to able to show them like what more time while designing can do versus what less time designing can do. Sometimes what I do is, like, let's say I was given a particular feature, I would work on it and try to like wrap it up by the end of the week if that's the timeline. But every now and then, if it's an interesting feature to work about, I would probably take a little more time after during my weekends and just work without any constraints on my own terms. That okay, what if I had a little more time? Would I introduce a nice interaction here? Would I include some animation here? And eventually I was able to show them that hey, I did spend 2 more extra days on it and this is the output. And that helped them understand that okay, this is the correlation between effort and time, so that if you do want to give it more time, this is the result we can expect.
In your case, you were leading a team at a very early stage, at an early career of your time, right? Could you think of any mistakes that you did in managing your team during that time, and who kind of mentored you to become the leader that you end up becoming at Front?
In my case, I was very quick to sort of highlight it out, and it was around the 6 month mark itself where I realized that okay, while I have learned a few things, I am not somehow feeling confident as my peers are in terms of their learning careers. So I need more structured mentorship, more structured learning that way. And they were quite open to the idea of hiring someone more senior. And I think we conducted interviews of over 60, 70 people just for a head of design role. But a lot of the times, I think people whom we interviewed, they were not really, very much on board with how much hustle early stage usually requires. So a lot of them were settled in good companies, and they wanted sort of a work which is a little more structured and not as chaotic as what it is in early stages. When we were in this process of finding someone and we sort of weren't really like getting someone that good, that was when I think my CTO, who I would directly report to, suggested that okay, I think we're not able to find someone right now, so maybe you can just continue as is, and then we will see what we can do about it. We can just continue doing this search, right? And one of the other reasons why I also like wanted some more leadership sort of a position to be filled is not just that the lack of learning. Another interesting problem that you would realize, so as I said earlier, we were just a two people team, right? And both people were like complete ICs. You need some sort of a creative alignment in terms of what you see the company as, right? Like in terms of aesthetics, in terms of your choices with colors, fonts, typography, everything, right? But when there are two different individuals working on two different aspects of a product, it's a very common pattern that I could see that the product sort of grew into two directions. We couldn't sort of have like the common brand language that we would want to create. That was like completely missing between our website and our app. So I that's also like not an ideal experience to a user, right? When they use a FrontRow product, they should know that this is a FrontRow product. That was the second problem, right? So when we realized that okay, it's going to be a bit difficult to find people that way, I just told them that until the time we do, maybe I should just step up to at least solve this part of the problem, where like we could collectively agree on a vision of how we want to do things, and then all of us can follow that. Because right now there's a huge amount of discrepancy between what we have on one part of the product versus the other part of the product. So that is when I started it, and it was very intimidating at first because I was managing people who were older than me, some were younger than me. And the fact that I was not just managing them, I was also doing my IC work, right? So one thing I would clearly see is that although I have seen people who are very successful managing both IC work and people management, but you need to sort of also give yourself a bit of space because it gets super hectic and you might burn out really quickly. So for a good amount of good few months, my schedule looked in a way where I would start work in the morning, and a lot of the work during the day would be mentoring people, working with them, sort of giving feedback or giving someone mentorship who's younger as an intern. But at the night is
Mm-hmm.
where I would actually get time to do my own IC work. So eventually I would
Mm-hmm.
end up days where I would like just end it on a 12-hour day, sometimes 13-hour day, which is something I didn't really find great after a point. Although initially the rush felt pretty great. Oh, I'm managing a team. That this
Mm-hmm.
sounds pretty cool.
Yeah.
But very quickly it
Yeah.
starts to sort of, get to you, where you're trying to think, okay, I think I have sort of more on my plate that I can chew. So I realized it very quickly that
Mm-hmm.
at certain times you need to learn to say no. Otherwise, you yourself would surround yourself with so much work that you're not able to do your best work. You're just doing mediocre at everything.
Yep.
So that was a
Yeah.
big learning. And then I think it's also a very, I think usually I used to value IC work a lot more. But I realized how people management is a completely different skill of its own. And it's a very, very interesting skill of how do you sort of manage or rather work with other human beings, right? Like whenever you're giving somebody a feedback, how can you not make it personal and make sure that they don't take that feedback personally?
It's good that you've got that knowledge so early in your career because it takes years for people to learn all those things and then apply and then figure out what mistakes they did. How was your experience working with, so much experienced founders at FrontRow? Like a few topics that you can touch upon is, how closely did you work on with them? How frequently did you interact with them? What was the collaboration like?
Yeah, so I think my interactions were super frequent because the sort of team we had, Shubhadit, who was my boss, who I would report to, he was technically the co-founder. He also was the CTO, and he would also take care of majority of the product. So the experience was pretty great. I think some of the key things which became very obvious to us is like how our thinking, because we were just starting out and we had very little experience of how to work with products. Our thinking was very first order in nature, where we would probably think of a feature and its implication on a local level. But with someone of his experience level, he has been working for close to 10 years, he's worked for pretty big companies as well. I think as a person who has that much amount of oversight, he is immediately able to see, oh, this will not just affect this whole small thing, it will affect a lot of other parts. So what's your solution to that? And what's your solution to this? So I think that product sense development, or how do you look at a holistic picture and constantly evaluate every little change with the implications that it could have, that was a very interesting sort of skill or a eye to learn. Like how do you look at problems with that lens, right? So my relationship
Yeah.
with them was very nice, very very supportive. Of course, like at certain times he would push me to work harder, and I would have to push him back that
Mm.
there's a lot of work. But I think he is one of the people who've impacted my life very very strongly in terms of his intellect
Mm.
and his how sharp he was with things, for sure.
What were the most common topics of conflict between you and Shivaji?
Between me and Shubhadip, the conflicts were not as much as it would be between me and the PMs. So a lot of times I would sort of fight with them to kind of educate them that, hey, while it might improve the numbers, this is not right, because this will basically trick the user into doing an action that they perhaps don't want to do, right? So that would be some points of conflict. And I think it becomes super important as well to ensure that the people whom you're working with, they sort of respect meritocracy over ego, right? Like if they actually find a good solution, they would accept that and not just suggest what they feel just because they are probably higher paid, or they have gone to a better college, or if they are more senior. So I think at front row especially, I think one of the qualities I do admire about Shubhadev was also the fact that he was an extremely humble person. If you sort of give him a feedback or say that, hey, no, this is wrong, he would think about it, and if he's wrong, he's like, yeah, you are right, this is not correct, let us rework on this.
I think the job of every designer, irrespective of what company you are at which scale, is to find alignment between business and you know, design. How can these two match to achieve the goals? And in early stage, the goal is always money, right? That's what we are chasing, right? That's the North Star metric. How did you end up finding the alignment between founder's vision, the business, and your design vision of what front row should be?
So a lot of the times I think that sense of alignment comes when you sit honestly with your founders, with the core contributors, and just talk about how do you see this company working in the next 6 months, what goals do you feel like we should solve. because that again reminds you and puts that big picture in front of all of you, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That has been quite helpful, and repeatedly asking that question, right? At certain times you might be focusing on growth, like you want a lot of numbers, you want a lot of installs, then perhaps the next sprint you are focusing on retaining those users, right? Or maybe in the next sprint you are doing a design overhaul, then the next sprint you are introducing a new feature. So at every point in this step, it's very, very important for you to keep reminding that, okay, from the last week, now this week we will work with a different mental model. So I will change the alignment of my expectations that way as well. So as frequently, I think that's something which is, it gets more difficult as the company grows because founders' time becomes more scarce, right? Like they don't have as much time. But I think that's an activity which every founder should do, is talk as much to their team as possible, because that is ultimately what keeps the team aligned on that vision.
I want to take the opportunity because you just mentioned that founders' times get scarce as the company grows. You also get some form of autonomy over the function that you are leading. Did you feel after some point that the autonomy was a responsibility?
Sure. I think the first and the foremost thing is probably like how you perceive that whole thing as, right? Like one part of it could be perceiving it as an opportunity, the other could be perceiving it as something which makes you very nervous that, okay, I'm going to be affecting a lot of things, right? So at least I think the initial part of it always has to be in a sense where you perceive that as an opportunity, like for you to try. I think one thing which becomes super important for founders or any leadership to ensure is that when you do give people autonomy, you also sort of give them a bit of room for failure, right? So that they're not afraid to fail. Because I remember one of my initial times when I was supposed to conduct the first interview that I did for someone else, like I interviewed someone else. I was super nervous that, okay, I am interviewing someone who has more experience than me. What if they ask me a question? What if I'm not able to answer? I was very nervous about things in general, right? But when I discussed this, when I asked my boss that, hey, these are my like concerns I have, I'm a bit anxious about these aspects. He said, it's okay. Like, what's the worst that can happen out of this interview? You'll blow it. He'll think like you're not good enough or whatever, and he'll leave. That's the worst that we can have at Max. And then so on at different stages. I think there's this sense of giving someone that room to fail often allows them to experiment and have that courage to move forward. Then that becomes super important. And I don't think at any point I did feel that there was any pressure that I was operating at a scale where a lot of users were using our app. At any time when I would see scale, it would always make me happy that, oh wow, I have designed something which is actually in so many people's hands. But I would always want to look at it and like, oh yeah, this part has been messed up. I need to fix this, or this could be so much better.
So now we've talked starting from your journey, how was your experience like? What are the things you have learned, the founder relationships and all? Because you now have at least one experience of working at a startup, right? And scaling it and also hiring designers. Could you shed some light on how should a designer negotiate joining a company as a first designer? Do touch a little bit on the split of ESOPs and cash if you have any experience with that.
In an early stage of your career, I think if you are able to somehow leverage a bit of pedigree, that helps. Pedigree, say what I mean is either you're from a reputed college, that tag helps you. Now these are not things that you can do a lot about. I'm just saying that what people I have seen value, right? I have seen people value pedigree. I have also seen people value having any experience of working in a decently other reputed company, right? Because reputation carries over that way. If you can get other people to vouch for you in terms of your competencies, that's also a very good value in terms of, let's say that you are interviewing for an early stage company, but you have worked with another founder who is well respected in the startup circles. You can get them to sort of write you a testimonial or vouch for your skill set. Like that is something you can negotiate on. In terms of ESOP, I think that again is a very interesting topic in its own. So I think I have very strong opinions about ESOP in general because of a few experiences I have had in my couple of stints at different startups. I do believe that ESOP should be looked at something which is pretty much like a lottery ticket. If I purchase a lottery ticket of 1 crore today, I wouldn't go on telling someone, hey, I have 1 crore worth of net worth because I can win this lottery. So why I say that is basically because I think as I came into the startup ecosystem, it took me a couple of years to understand how ESOPs work, what is the probability of a successful exit for you as an employee and everything. There are great examples, but there are also majority of people actually probably don't make a lot of money from ESOPs, right? So it requires you to like spend some time and understand it for yourself, that what do you value? Do you really value that long-term game, and are you going to play that game of probabilities where you believe that this company will grow enough to sort of give you a buyback, or will it even go public one day and give you that kind of a bigger buyback? I would say, like, if you are genuinely interested in ESOP, there's this talk that I could, which helped me massive. This founder called Deepak Abbot. He runs this company called India Gold, and he conducted a very small session on explaining how ESOPs work. That should be definitely something that everybody should see before they consider including ESOPs in the contract. A lot of companies actually have that habit of including ESOPs into your CTC and sort of, showing it as a collective package and matching it with whatever existing package you have. So that is something I wouldn't really like. If you understand ESOPs and if you've done your research, you'll be able to see through that okay, this is not my salary. This is just something which is a promise in future. If you believe that a particular company has been showing a very rapid growth, it has a very linear or rapid growth or linear growth, they are cash flow positive, there's EBITDA positive, there's a lot of good signals to suggest that they will continue to generate value and they're not burning a lot of cash, CM break even, a lot of good factors suggesting the business is doing good, then I think you can take a bet and get some amount of your salary in ESOPs, which can translate to a good amount of money in future. But I think, as I'm not sure if like people who are watching this would know, that whenever you do get ESOPs, there are different factors. Like if the company gets acquired, then you might get a buyback from secondary share purchasing. Or if your company runs a buyback during the next fundraise, then you might get it. Or when your company goes public, then you might get it. So these events are not going to be very frequent. So you might need to play the long-term game. So if you don't have as much financial obligations and you genuinely believe that the company is going to generate value, then you can 100% opt for certain amount of your salary in ESOPs. But otherwise, if you have cash commitments, you really need to pay your bills or invest in other stuff, then I would actually say that you should evaluate whether ESOPs is going to be helpful for you or you want to generate returns in other ways.
Tell me like some key metrics that a viewer who's viewing this podcast and is interviewing at a company could ask to evaluate whether the company is performing good or not.
In terms of hard metrics purely, I think you should be generating revenue. Like a lot of companies in the 2021 sort of era, the ZERP era that we were seeing, they were extremely cash burning businesses where they would not generate a lot of revenue, but they had projections to generate revenue. And that's a lot of VC backed businesses work that way. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think in the last couple of years or so, the sentiment has changed in a certain way where a lot of businesses, as you would see, they all are chasing profitability, from your biggest of unicorns to even a small company, which I think is a very good signal, right? People are focusing on generating value from day one than a promise of a value, right? So a good sign to also see is that, is the company already cash flow positive? Like, is their expenses less than what they are making? That's also a very good way to look at it. Other than that, does the company also have a good amount of growth? Certain companies stagnate after a certain point, or like they've achieved an initial PMF, but after that there's no growth. So you would want to see a good amount of year-on-year growth in their revenue, and hopefully you see their expenses going down and the profits going up. If a company is purposefully pushing you to get more ESOPs than cash, that in my books is a red flag, because if a company actually values their stocks, they values their shares, you would want to fight to get ESOPs. You should not be the one to say कि भाई आप cash कम ले लो and get ESOPs. Like, I'll ESOPs की एक बाल्टी लाके हम आपके लिए रख देते हैं. That's probably not a good thing, right? Like, you can ask a company, what is the ESOP pool like? So there would be a equity split that they would have. Some founders would hold a certain shares. The investors would hold a certain amount of shares. But do they have a huge ESOP pool or do they have a very small ESOP pool? That's a good way to think and understand. You should probably also look at when was the last fundraise done for the company. So if they had an immediate fundraise, you would probably expect that this is going to be a more longer term event for you now. But if they've had a bunch of time, it's been a while since they had raised funds and now they're looking to raise funds, this is a very good time, because you would be getting your ESOPs at the previous valuation, and post the fundraise, your ESOPs valuation would increase. Right. And there are these other factors as well, right? There's a cliff period, then there's a 4-year vesting schedule. So if you join today and you leave in like like you join the 1st of January and leave in December 25th, like on the Christmas day, you will get nothing. All your ESOPs are valued at zero.
Yep.
You need to first finish the first year cliff period, after which the ESOPs will get started allotted to you. And then certain companies have a vesting schedule where they allot every 6 months. Certain companies do on a pro rata basis. Certain companies wait for a whole year to finish before they
Yeah.
allocate ESOPs to you.
How would you, based on your experience of working as a consultant now having worked at a startup, build a team, evaluate if you were to join, let's say, an early stage company, where let's say 10 people who has received some seed funding some time back?
It's called a 4P framework, where there are 4 Ps, right? The first P is pay. So you need to consider that, does this company pay well? And it's not a like it's a subjective metric. For you, it can be a huge upgrade if you've been working in a studio, for example, which typically usually pay less. Or it could be a downgrade if you've been working in, I don't know, consultancy, like big tech consultancy firm like McKinsey or something like that. So the point being here is, one is pay. So you need to first of all have a number in your head, like, okay, this is what I feel I should be getting. And is the company able to offer you that pay? The second is people, right? Like people, the people part I think is a very important factor, because I think ultimately very few products actually succeed for their idea. It's always a bunch of people coming together and working for it. So you need to think of people who you work as quite highly, because you need to connect with them on a moral level. You need to connect with them as a friend. You want to be able to respect them. So at any place, like if you see that, okay, I know that I have to get a job, but these kind of people who work here, they don't seem to match my vibe. They don't seem to be friendly. I don't want to be friends with them. I think personally for me, it becomes very difficult that way to be able to work there, right? Typically, what you should be looking at is, are you working with smart people, right? Like, do you talk to someone in the company during an interview process and you ask them a question, which could be a difficult question? Do they answer it smartly? If you Interviewing is a two-way process, by the way. I think we often seem to forget that, but it is equally important for you to also ask questions to people and understand who are they in general, as well, as much as they want to know who you are. So I think people becomes very important. A lot of times, whatever idea that the company is working on would fail, the company might need to pivot, and in the end, what would always remain are the people, right? That becomes a very important factor. The third is what you could call purpose or passion. When you work on a product that you connect with, that you feel passionate about, naturally your level of curiosity will be much higher, your enthusiasm will be so much higher, and it actually shows up in the work. Whereas if you're working in an industry that you don't believe in, you just are doing it for the money, then it very clearly becomes evident that you're just doing the bare minimum, and maybe at certain times you're pushing it as well, but it does not come naturally. You have to push for it. So I think it also becomes fairly important that you consider what that company does in certain way you seem to relate to it. And the last is performance of the company, right? Now, this is something which is the toughest one to decide, because when you talk about early stage companies, a lot of them are sort of built on certain promises. Like if they've raised a seed fund, it could be at whatever stage. Maybe they have already launched a product, they have seen some traction. But in a lot of cases, it is just a great hypothesis that seems to have a market, and they are just beginning to take a crack at it. So here I would say some sort of domain knowledge definitely helps. So these kind of having a general sort of sense, or having a bit of understanding of that domain, becomes massively helpful for you to also realize the performance of the company, which is the last P, that are they going to be performing well enough for you to join this team, or are they just trying something out but it has very little conviction, you yourself have very little conviction that way. So I think a combination of these four, in an ideal case, you would want all of these four boxes to be checked, but it's not often possible. It becomes a bit unrealistic at times. I think a lot of these conversations, I think we keep happening once here or there, but I really feel great that
Yeah, that makes sense. That was a great answer, though. The 4P method. I'm sure it's going to be helpful for a lot of people who are listening to this episode. I don't think I have any further questions. We've kind of covered everything. So thanks for the episode, man. Thanks for coming down here. How was your experience?
you are sort of taking all this time to bring learning from so many people, and putting it in one place. If I had a lot of these learnings that I'm sharing with you today at when I started my career, I think that would have been very helpful. So I hope that this becomes equally helpful for people who are starting out in their careers, who are considering working in early stage companies as a founding designer specifically. So yeah, it's been a wonderful time to talk about.
Yeah, I hope the same, man. Best of luck for your future endeavors, for your future opportunities. So that concludes our episode with Aditya Das. I thank every single one of you who's still here watching this episode at the end. If you know someone who has been a founding designer at an early stage company, then do DM me. My Instagram and social links are down in the description and in the first comment. If you liked the episode and if you found it valuable, do two things. One, press the like button. Let Aditya and I know that you liked and appreciated the episode. And share this episode to at least one person, because this conversation can help someone else apart from you. Do reach out to me via LinkedIn, Instagram, or any socials that are mentioned in the description below. I would love to talk to you and bring you over here to learn and talk about your experiences. If you have any feedback for me, for Aditya, or for this episode, do write them in the comments down below. I would love to engage in a conversation with you. I will see you in the next video. Thank you for watching. This is Manav Chenkui.